Hi, this is Adam. Welcome to our Rare Classic Car channel. Today we have a fun one for you. Piece of automotive history here. This is a 1959 Pontiac Parisienne, a Canadian Pontiac. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about the Canadian cars and what the differences were, why that occurred, and I guess some of the unique features of them. So in Canada, until about the mid-70s, there were some restrictive import duties and laws that really forced the automakers to use more local content when making vehicles. So this car actually has, if you compare it to a US 59 Pontiac, it has a number of Canadian-sourced components, or quite a few Canadian-sourced components, really to help make sure that GM wasn't paying those import tariffs. And you can imagine that if you have to build and produce in a country where the population is a tenth of the size of the US, and make the cars economically feasible from a cost standpoint, you have to get a lot of scale in sourcing the parts. And so this is one reason why these Pontiacs ride atop a Chevrolet chassis and use a lot of components that are common with the Chevrolets. So you can see this in this wheel is humorously inboard here because it's a Chevrolet Impala chassis. So this is not a wide track Pontiac. This is a narrow track Pontiac. And it's accentuated by the bumper kind of flares out at the bottom here while the wheel is way inboard. You can see the rear wheel is also way inboard. Again, because it's an Impala chassis. And the rear wheel's also off-center from the wheel arch for the same reason. So this is really a Frankenstein car. It's a US Pontiac Catalina body. In other words, the short body, which you can also tell it has a small tail lights. The Bonneville had bigger tail lights. But in spite of it being the short body, it has the sweep spear and the Bonneville trim. And it rides atop a Chevy Impala chassis with a US medium-duty truck engine. This has a 261 cubic inch six-cylinder, so a bigger version of the 235 that was in the Impalas in the US. You could only get it in the US in medium-duty trucks and buses. And it has a Power Glide, 2-speed automatic. So it's really quite the Frankenstein vehicle. But again, a lot of this was done so that you could get appropriate scale. These could be built on the same assembly line with Chevrolets. This car was built in Oshawa, Ontario, where you could, as I said, they also built the Chevrolets there. So you could go down the same assembly line. It used quite a bit of the same components. And even though you had to locally source components, and you didn't have quite the volumes, or anywhere near the volumes, honestly, as the US, by sharing those components, you could get more scale on some key running gear, and GM could keep the cost down. And for many years, Pontiac was the value and, I would say, top-of-the-line brand in Canada. Chevrolet was perceived as basically a box with four wheels. And even up until recently, Chevrolet just didn't have great brand equity in Canada. Pontiac was the mainline brand. Really, and that's how the dealer network was set up in Canada as well, was Pontiac dealers were far more numerous than Chevrolet dealers. Pontiac far outsold Chevrolet. Even in modern times, GMC outsells Chevrolet in Canada because that legacy dealer network was so Pontiac-centric. And when Pontiac was disbanded, really hurt General Motors' market share in Canada. A lot of those dealers went on to become Hyundai dealers or Kia dealers. And only now is GM starting to kind of regain some of that share that they once had in Canada. It took many years, almost 10 years, to get over that closure of Pontiac. But you'll see for years that even after the mid-70s, when those laws went away, Canada got some specific Pontiac vehicles like the Tempest, which was a rebadged Corsica. And interestingly, some of you will be familiar with the Parisienne from the 80s, the full-size car that was similar to the Chevrolet Caprice. That came about because Pontiac in the early 80s decided that they thought that fuel standards were going to dictate that gas was going to be, at this time, let's say adjusted for inflation, $5, $6 a gallon. And Pontiac dropped the full-size Bonneville from its lineup and transitioned it to be a G-body car. So you can imagine that plan seemed good on paper, but when time came around, fuel prices actually had dropped in the 80s, and Pontiac dealers in the US were screaming to get another vehicle. So enter the Parisienne. Some of you, again, will have known that in the US. Effectively, what Pontiac did is they just started importing the Parisienne that was still produced in Canada, which was a rebadged Caprice. So that car was not originally intended to be for sale in the US. It was a last-minute fire drill fix for the fact that Pontiac had no true full-size car, at least as they perceived it. And that's how the Parisienne came to be known in the US. But that was its birth. The Pontiac had dropped the full-size Bonneville, made it a G-body. Dealers were clamoring, and when fuel prices dropped, that they needed a true full-size car. They were getting killed by the Chevrolet dealers who still had the Caprice. And so they decided to import the Parisienne from Canada, where it was still being made. But again, these Canadian Pontiacs are different all the way up until the mid-70s. They use the Chevrolet powertrains and running gear. And interestingly, if you look at Pontiac brochures from Canada in the mid-70s, they had the Canadian Pontiacs and the US Pontiacs in the showroom at the same time. So they still had the Laurentian, the Parisienne, the Strato-Chief, at the same time as the Catalina, the Bonneville, and sometimes the Granville or the Bonneville Brome. So look up a Canadian Pontiac brochure from 1975, and you're going to see a very confused showroom as they tried to transition away from the Canadian Pontiac more toward a US Pontiac as those vehicles or those import duties and laws were relaxed. So one other little treat I have here about these, I actually worked for General Motors Canada for a while, and look what I have here. A price study from 1959, or I guess September 15th of 1958 for the 1959 cars. This was getting thrown in the garbage as I arrived, and I saved it, of course, because I had that car. So just to show you a little bit more about this, and since this was thrown in the garbage, it's public information. Anybody can go in somebody's garbage, so be careful what you throw out. It becomes public property once you put it out near the curb. Here's the Chevrolet six-cylinder, and this is a four-door hardtop. You can see that they were planning on producing 666 units of the Chevrolet six-cylinder Impala, so really not many at all, with a prevailing list price or proposed list price, let's say here, of $2,833, and an operating profit of $142, or 7% of net sales. Now, if I look at the same page for the Parisienne six-cylinder, so this is 2,833 is the proposed list price. The Parisienne is 2,883, so $50 more. That was it, $50. And the operating profit is down to 5.6% of sales. So it was only $50 more, and it made the company less money. And by the way, they were planning to sell 359 Parisienne six-cylinder four-door hardtops. That's it. So that is one rare car. Now, they did plan to sell a bit more of the V8 Parisienne Laurentians. So here's total Parisienne V8. They were going to sell 5,693 or 1,000 of these four-door hardtops. And the V8s, if you look at the operating profit, 5.3% of sales, and the V8 was going to propose list price was $3,003. So $120 more than the six-cylinder model. But nonetheless, if you look at any of these combinations, they were not planning to sell all that many vehicles in Canada. And so anything that you find now is pretty rare, because so many of these cars just had rust issues, as you can imagine. They didn't survive the overall, salt and conditions. And here's Principal Pontiac, how many units they were planning to sell. 44,213. Now remember, Canada is about at the 10th of the size of the US, so that would have been equivalent to about 440,000 units in the US. But many of those were non-Parisienne, Laurentian, Strato-Chiefs, base vehicles. And just for reference, you want to see what the Oldsmobile they were going to have the cost be. I think it's on this page. Let's see, four-door hardtop Oldsmobile, $3,242. So about $350 more than the Parisienne. And that's just the 88 series. So I'm guessing that that's the Del Monte 88, given that this is the Super 88 here. So, a little interesting tidbit of history. Unfortunately, like I said, these were all getting thrown away as I arrived, and I happened to save that one for my car from the garbage bin. But let's quickly take a look here. So this is the 261 cubic inch 6-cylinder. And it's a wonderfully smooth motor. Big one-barrel Rochester carburetor. I love how they have the Pontiac sticker on the air cleaner here. And you can see it's manufactured by Donaldson Company of Canada, so locally sourced component. And number of chalk marks still on this car. Look at, you can see the frame, how narrow the frame is and how inboard it is of the wheel arches as well on this car. But it drives wonderfully. In spite of being a huge Frankenstein car, I mean, just look at this motor when I start it up. Also has a Chevrolet steering wheel and column with the Power Glide shift quadrant, and different than what was on the Chevrolets, but kind of a unique Pontiac horn ring, which the horn sounds great. But here, I'll start it up. Can you hear it running? What a wonderful engine. This has a pretty short rear end, probably a 355, something in that zip code. So top speed on this car is redline limited to about 80 miles an hour. But around town, it's quite peppy and extremely smooth, as you can see. I mean, this is one of the smoothest motors I've ever experienced. And it has an externally rotating distributor. Watch this. No, the distributor is not loose. This is how it is from the factory. Isn't that funky? So that vacuum advance can at the bottom is fixed and doesn't move. There's not a movable breaker plate inside. It actually rotates the distributor externally. But just a cool, fun ride. The hood's got a number of dents and dings on it because it was just tucked away in a garage for many years and things dropped on it, but I'm not going to touch it. I don't want to disturb. This is all original paint on this car. And no, it's not perfect, but it's only original once. And this actually isn't even acrylic lacquer. This is a cheaper paint that they used in Canada. But I think, you know, from 5 feet away, it looks like a new car. And I just think that it has so much character, I'm not going to touch it. I much prefer my cars original and imperfect versus, let's call it perfect and not original. The interior is all original as well. It had seat covers on it when I bought it that were yellowing and looking tired, so I took them off. But beautifully preserved seats. Well, it's warm in there. It's cold today, but the heater works really well on this car. And a really cool headliner. With the US Pontiac dash, the speedo's even in miles per hour. Canadian cars until 1978 used miles per hour. After that was kilometers. Just a cool old car. It's funny, I remember when I was a kid, my dad, who's now deceased, he loved the 59 Pontiac. It was his favorite car. He always wanted one. And I found this after he passed away. But I remember him telling me about how he, thought these Canadian Pontiacs were just junk and you don't want to find one. Well, as is true with most things, the stuff that was uncool in the past now is super cool because it's gone. And I don't know how many of these Parisiennes are left in any condition. It can't be many. But they are pretty much extinct. You still see Bonnevilles and Catalinas and Star-Chiefs around, but you don't see hardly any 59 Canadian Pontiacs. And to me, that's what really makes it special. The uniqueness of the car, that you don't see them anymore. So this one will continue to be well preserved. I love driving it. I wish I could drive it more on the freeway, but with the relatively short rear end, I can change the rear end, but it's not worth it to me. It gives the car some character. I don't need to drive every car on the freeway. It's fine up to about 60, 65, and then the motor starts spinning pretty fast. But around town, it's just a joy. I'll also feature, Ford did something similar to this. They had the Meteor and Monarch brands, not cars, brands in Canada. So I have a 68 Meteor Montcalm, and it's very similar. It's a Mercury body with a Ford interior and Ford chassis components. And so it's basically a Park Lane body with an LTD interior and a unique grille. And there were Mercury pickups in Canada, also because of the dealer network. Remember that a rural dealer had to serve many different customers. So if you had a Mercury dealer, they really needed a full line of products. So they sold the Meteor brand, which was a competitor to the Canadian Pontiac, a lower end Mercury, if you will. And there are things like for Chryslers, there were Fargo pickups as well. So there's a lot of unique stuff in Canada. I think the Mercury pickups are cool. You even find them with the Mercury wheel covers from the US. So lots of unique Canadian vehicle heritage. They had the Chevelle, their version of the Chevelle was the Beaumont. It was called the Acadian, which was their smaller kind of compact car. In the US, they had the Catalina 2+2, and Pontiac had the Sport Deluxe Parisienne, which would have some Chevrolet powertrain like a 283 in it. So really, really neat automotive pieces of history, and pretty much, I would say, extinct pieces of automotive history. So I'm happy to have this in my Meteor Montcalm. I think at some point, the market for these is pretty thin, but at some point the historians will appreciate these for what they are, and even if they don't, I don't care. I love driving the car. I love taking it to car shows. People look at it and like, what in the world is that? Most of them recognize the Parisienne name from the 80s Parisienne. They don't know the full history, at least some of it, that I gave you. Hope you enjoyed this discussion about the Canadian Pontiacs and the review of my Parisienne here. I'm going to go get in the car because it's cold. You can see the steam coming from the exhaust pipe. But just a wonderful car. Have a nice day.